History often speaks of conquerors and kings, of empires rising and falling in the dust of ambition. But every few centuries there comes a rivalry so profound, so symmetrically fated, that it transcends the battlefield and enters the realm of legend. This is not merely the story of Richard the Lionheart or Saladin the Great. It is the story of East and West, steel and scripture, pride and purpose clashing beneath the sun-scorched skies of the Holy Land. Two men led armies, yes. But more than that, each, in his own way, led civilizations. And though they fought with fire understood, here's the English translation of the revised passage, incorporating the suggested improvements for flow, depth, and impact. It wasn't faith that drew swords in the 12th century. Not entirely. It was pride, it was politics, and it was men who thought they could change the world or burn it down trying. Imagine a world where kingdoms rise and fall not by the will of people, but at the whim of kings. Where dusty roads lead to blood-soaked battlefields, and a city's fate can be decided by a single charge. The Holy Land Jerusalem and the lands surrounding it had long become the chessboard of Europe and the Middle East. But by the late 1100s, the pieces were in motion again, and two names were about to collide like no others before or after. Richard of England, Saladin of Egypt and Syria. One a lion in armor, reckless, brilliant, and unforgiving. The other a calculating sultan, devout, wise, and equally ruthless. They would fight not just for cities or relics, but for the idea of control, of legacy, of God. But before the swords clashed, and before the flags of war were raised, the world was tense. The Crusader states, small, Christian-controlled kingdoms carved into Muslim lands, had been holding onto the Holy Land by the edge of a knife. Agreements, uneasy truces, and fragile borders barely kept the region from exploding. And in the West, kings were watching. Europe was changing, and a new player was about to enter the field. The spark before the fire. It all began not with an army, but with a rogue act of arrogance. In 1187, a Crusader noble, Reynold of Chatillon, broke a fragile truce. He attacked Muslim caravans, slaughtered pilgrims, and refused to return prisoners. For years, this man had been a thorn in Saladin's side, a symbol of the unchecked brutality of the Crusaders. And now he had crossed the line. Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, would no longer tolerate it. No more diplomacy, no more warnings. He gathered his forces. Unified fractured Muslim territories, he would no longer play defense. He would retake Jerusalem. But Saladin didn't charge blindly. He lured the Crusaders into a trap. At Hattin, he crushed the Christian armies burned by the sun, parched without water and surrounded. Reynold was captured and personally executed by Saladin. The true cross, a relic said to be from the crucifixion of Jesus, was taken, and within weeks Jerusalem fell. The Christian world reeled. And in Europe the Pope called for the Third Crusade. This time not nobles, not mercenaries, kings would answer the call. Enter Richard the Lionheart. Thousands of miles away in England, a new king had just taken the throne. Richard I, son of a leaner of Aquitaine, and Henry II, bold, tall, with flaming red gold hair and a warrior's instincts. But Richard was more than a king. He was a born commander, raised in rebellion, trained in siege warfare, and obsessed with honor, conquest, and his image. Richard saw the crusade not just as duty but as destiny. He yearned to carve his name into history, to eclipse the kings who came before him. He would leave his own kingdom in the hands of others, knowing the risks. He had no intention of ruling a peaceful land. He intended to forge a legend. Meanwhile, France, too, joined the call. King Philip II, Richard's rival and uneasy ally, sailed east. So did Leopold of Austria and thousands of knights, peasants, and men of the cross. But destiny does not favor haste. By the time Richard arrived, the battles had already begun. Siege of Acre. The opening chess moves. The Crusaders had encircled Acre, a Muslim-held port. But the siege was a disaster. Disease, starvation, and heat devastated both sides. The city held out. Muslim reinforcements harassed the Christians. Morale was crumbling. Then Richard arrived. Though sick with fever, he immediately took command. He was not a king who watched battles from balconies. He ordered siege engines constructed, naming them things like God's own catapult and the bad neighbor. Even lying on a stretcher, he gave orders and fired a crossbow from the front lines. Under his leadership, Acre fell. And then came the massacre. In retaliation for delayed ransom negotiations, Richard executed nearly 2,700 Muslim prisoners, beheading them in front of Saladin's camp. The message was clear: cross me and you will witness Christian fury. Saladin in return executed all his Christian captives, and just like that the rivalry began not as warriors but as legends. Part 2. Blood and Sand, the Battle of Arsuf. The year is 1191, the air over the Levant coast is thick with dust, sea mist, and tension. Richard has taken Acre, but Jerusalem remains untouchable. He knows it, Saladin knows it. To reach the holy city, Richard must push south. But instead of marching blindly into the heartland, he opts for a calculated move: Jaffa, a port city roughly 80 miles from Acre, will become the Crusaders' next staging point. From there they can build supply lines to fuel their push toward Jerusalem. But the road to Jaffa was no ordinary road at all. It was a narrow, sun-scorched path with dense woods on one side and the sea on the other. A perfect place for an ambush, and Saladin was watching, the eyes in the forest. Unlike many of his predecessors, Saladin didn't fight with brute force. He fought with patience. As Richard's massive army trudged south along the coastline, Saladin's forces trailed them through the forest, hidden, waiting, listening. He wasn't looking for a duel, he was searching for a fracture. His plan was elegant. Wear them down with heat, exhaustion, and hunger, strike when their formation faltered, break the line, crush their morale. Saladin knew the lessons of Hatton, and he knew Richard wasn't like the other Crusader leaders, but every king has his limit. Richard's march, arrogance or genius? Let's be clear, Richard wasn't just a brute in shining armor. He was arrogant, yes, impulsive, absolutely. But he was also one of the most adaptive military minds of his time. Richard knew Saladin was watching, he knew an ambush was inevitable. And so he marched carefully. He kept the infantry close to the coast, using the sea as a natural shield. Mounted knights guarded the rear, especially the elite Knights Hospitaller. Supply ships shadowed the march from sea, delivering fresh water and food to avoid the deadly thirst of past campaigns. Richard personally walked the line daily, sometimes on horseback, often on foot. His presence was an unspoken reminder, you do not follow me, you fight with me. But even kings must rest. And even the most rigid formations can grow thin when stretched too long. Saladin was waiting. And on September 7, 1191, he struck, the ambush at Arsuf. It began just after dawn. The Crusaders were breaking camp near the ruins of Arsuf when the sound of war drums rose from the forest. Trumpets screamed. The earth quaked beneath tens of thousands of charging horsemen. From the hills, Saladin's mounted archers poured into view, over 25,000 strong, a tide of armor, arrows, and fury. Richard's army was barely 12,000 men. The Muslims launched arrow after arrow into the Crusader ranks, taking out horses, pack animals, and any man foolish enough to peek above a shield. The Crusaders formed a tight box, shields locked, crossbows ready. They could withstand the barrage, but the pressure mounted. "My king," the Hospitallers cried from the rear, "let us charge." Richard stood firm. If he let them break ranks now, Saladin's cavalry would pierce through the opening and shatter everything. He waited, more arrows, more chaos. The heat was brutal. Every second Richard delayed seemed like cowardice to some, but brilliance to others. The spark breaks the line. And then it happened. The strain was unbearable. The sun beat down, arrows rained, and the screams of fallen comrades echoed. Then, whether from raw rage, sheer panic, or the desperate courage of men pushed to their limit, a unit of Hospitaller knights could bear it no longer. With a defiant cry, they broke formation and charged into the enemy lines, shields lowered, lances forward. Richard had mere seconds to decide. The disciplined general in him screamed to hold, but the warrior king knew the line was teetering. To do nothing meant certain collapse, to commit meant an all-or-nothing gamble. So with a roar that cut through the din, he did what he always did. He grabbed his sword, mounted his warhorse, and bellowed, "Sound the charge, all units, now." The trumpets blared 6 times, and the Crusader line erupted like a coiled spring. Knights in steel armor thundered forward, cutting through the battlefield like a storm unleashed. The Muslims faltered. They had expected hesitation, not fury. They had anticipated fear, not the roar of lions let loose. The clash. The Battle of Arsuf wasn't clean, it wasn't noble, it was brutal. Steel clashed against curved blades. Screams filled the air, horses fell, men drowned in their own blood. But for every man Saladin lost, the Crusaders gained ground. Richard led from the front, not with strategy now, but with rage. He fought like a man possessed. One witness wrote that his sword moved so fast it disappeared in the sunlight. Saladin's men tried to lure the Crusaders into the woods, but Richard didn't fall for it. He halted the charge just short of the trap, regaining formation at the last second. Saladin, watching from afar, remained utterly silent. The battle had not gone as planned. This was no ordinary Christian king. This was a force of nature, a foe unlike any he had faced before. This was something else entirely. The Siege of Patience, Jaffa, and the Broken March. September 1191. Richard's sword is still wet with victory. The Battle of Arsuf has ended in Christian triumph. The Saracens have retreated. And the road to Jaffa, the vital key to Jerusalem, lies open. The Crusader camp erupts in triumphant chants and hymns. The men believe this is it. The final charge will soon bring down the walls of Jerusalem. The holy city, the very jewel of their faith, is finally within their grasp. But Richard remains silent. Because deep down, the Lionheart knows wars are not won in a single day, especially not against a man like Saladin. Jaffa more than a city. Jaffa is more than a military objective. It's a crucial port, a natural base of operations from which to launch supply lines and plan the march inland. Yet when the Crusaders arrived, the triumphant chants died in their throats. Instead of a bustling port, they found a desolate shell, a city battered, crumbling, barely able to host an army, let alone sustain a long campaign. The bitter cost of Saladin's retreat was immediately apparent. The Crusaders were forced to halt to rebuild, fortifications were repaired, watchtowers rose, and supplies were ferried in daily. Richard began to plan his advance on Jerusalem, meticulously drawing up a chain of fortified outposts to protect the path. He understood logistics better than most kings ever had. And he knew that without food, water, and shelter, his army would perish long before they ever touched Jerusalem's sacred stones. But while Richard built, Saladin destroyed Saladin's new weapon. The Sultan of Egypt and Syria had learned his harsh lesson. He knew he couldn't match Richard in an open field, not after Arsuf. So he began to fight a different war. He burned every village and fort along the expected Crusader route. He emptied wells, poisoned water sources, and destroyed storehouses. He sent ceaseless raiding parties to harass supply lines, stealing food, scattering troops. Where once he stood as a tangible general, now he became a phantom and elusive force, striking from the shadows and vanishing into the desert, leaving only desolation in his wake. The goal was simple: slow the Crusaders down. Frustrate them, drain their resources and their will, make them question their holy cause, and it worked. Richard's army fractures. For weeks, the Crusaders remained in Jaffa and nearby strongholds, rebuilding and marching in circles. They weren't fighting, they weren't conquering, they were toiling as mere laborers, and they grew restless. Many of them had come from noble houses eager for glory and salvation. But here they were digging trenches, hauling rocks, eating stale bread. They whispered in tents at night, "Why won't the king move? Is he afraid? We came for Jerusalem, not Jaffa." The pressure mounted. Richard knew the value of iron discipline, but he wasn't deaf to the murmurs of discontent and the looming threat of political upheaval. If he waited too long, he could lose the army not to Saladin but to desertion. So under immense pressure he marched, the first march on Jerusalem. It was now early winter, rain began to fall. The mud clung to boots and wagon wheels, making the road treacherous. And still, Richard pushed forward. They came within 12 miles of Jerusalem. From the hills, the golden domes of the city glinted deceptively in the mist. The men fell to their knees and wept. For many, this was the closest they had ever come to salvation. But as the army set camp near Beit Nuba, their hopeful eyes fixed on the distant domes, Richard ascended a rocky outcrop. He gazed at the holy city, shimmering in the deceptive light, and the grim reality of their position froze him to the bone. The weather was worsening. Supply lines were dangerously overextended. His men were utterly unprepared for a sustained siege. And worse, if they managed to take the city, they might not be able to hold it. Saladin's vast armies could encircle them, cut them off, and slaughter them inside the very walls they fought so hard to claim. So Richard made a decision, one that would define him forever. He turned back, the disillusionment. To see Jerusalem with their own eyes and then retreat shattered morale. Men screamed at the heavens. Some threw down their crosses in despair. Others abandoned the army entirely and headed back to Acre. Richard's formidable reputation began to crack. He tried to redirect the campaign toward Egypt, a bold, strategic plan to cut off Saladin's economic power. But the remaining lords flatly refused. Their faith was broken, they no longer believed. They wanted Jerusalem or nothing. Even those closest to him began to doubt, but amid the turmoil, something unexpected began to grow. The strange respect between rivals. Throughout the campaign, Richard and Saladin had been sending envoys to one another, formal, often sharp, but always steeped in a peculiar respect. One of Saladin's most trusted emissaries was Al-Adil, his brother. Through long, often intense discussions and shared meals, Al-Adil and Richard developed an odd, burgeoning friendship. Their conversations, initially formal and sharp, gradually softened. They began with intricate tactical discussions, then flowed into shared appreciations for poetry, the subtleties of culture, and even lighthearted mentions of family. Richard even jokingly suggested Al-Adil marry his sister to unite their houses, though he never asked her permission, of course. But beneath the humor lay something deeper: mutual understanding. Richard began to see Saladin not as a savage or an infidel, but as a ruler just like himself, a man burdened by great responsibilities, bound by a strict code of honor, and driven by a deep sense of duty. And Saladin. He saw Richard as the one Christian he could not outmaneuver. Meanwhile, in Europe, while Richard fought a draining war in the Holy Land, his enemies moved decisively at home. King Philip of France, Richard's former comrade-in-arms, plotted with Prince John, Richard's own ambitious brother, to seize the English throne. Word reached Richard's camp like a thunderbolt. He now fought two wars, one in the east, one in the west. and if he stayed much longer he might lose everything he ever ruled, but leaving would mean abandoning the Holy Land, betraying his oath. He was trapped not by walls, but by impossible choices. Part 4, The Lion's Last Gamble, Jaffa under siege. Summer 1192. The Holy Land is utterly exhausted. For over a year and a half, two forces so different in faith, yet so strikingly similar in their unyielding fire, have clashed, parried, retreated, and rebuilt. Jerusalem still stands unconquered. Armies are thinning, their ranks bleeding away, resources are critically low, and kings are beginning to bend under the immense strain. But war, like fate itself, never ends in silence. In the quiet, oppressive heat of July, Saladin makes his final, decisive move. Jaffa falls. With Richard momentarily away at Acre, desperately rallying reinforcements and attempting to salvage the fading momentum of his campaign, Saladin strikes at the very heart of the Crusader foothold. The city of Jaffa. He moves with chilling swiftness. Tens of thousands of his troops descend upon the half-fortified port city. The walls, manned by a mere skeleton force of Christian knights, survivors barely clinging to life after the last brutal campaign, offer little resistance. There's no time to prepare, no hope of reinforcement. Jaffa is terrifyingly vulnerable. Saladin orders a full, relentless assault. Siege towers roll forward, a grim tide. Scaling ladders rise against the crumbling ramparts. The valiant defenders fight fiercely, but by the third day the walls are breached. Chaos erupts in the streets, and blood runs freely between stones older than kings. The remaining crusaders fall back to the citadel, their last desperate stronghold. From there, a frantic, desperate message is sent to the King of England: Jaffa falls, we will not last. The messenger reaches Richard. It's August 1st, 1192. Richard is at Acre, nursing a battered army and a spirit bruised by endless setbacks. When the messenger stumbles into his war tent, bloodied, breathless, eyes wide with terror, Richard does not hesitate. He gathers a strike force of barely 2,000 men. They board ships under cover of darkness and sail south with the wind, a desperate race toward a city already believed lost. His generals plead with him. "Sire, the risk is too great, you must not go." He answers with unshakable conviction. "It is not risk, it is necessity." Arrival by sea, the Lion wades ashore. As Richard's ships approach Jaffa, a black flag, Saladin's banner, flies ominously atop the city walls. The crusaders aboard begin to despair, convinced they're too late, but then a sudden, audacious splash. A figure, armored save for his helm, leaps from the lead ship directly into the churning surf. It is Richard. Sword strapped to his back, crossbow slung over one shoulder, he begins to swim with powerful, determined strokes toward the enemy-held shore. The other knights, frozen in disbelief, watch their king. Then, as if a spell was broken, a murmur turns into a roar, and one by one they follow their Lionheart into the sea, weapons held overhead, their armor gleaming in the rising sun. The Muslim soldiers watching from the ramparts freeze not in fear, but in sheer awe. Who does this? What kind of king storms a city by swimming into it, street by street, blade by blade? Richard reaches the shore first. He loads his crossbow, fires the first bolt with deadly accuracy, and then draws steel, his blade glinting. He fights his way up the beach, into the lower city, cutting through Saladin's stunned soldiers with the raw fury of a man who has nothing left to lose but his honor. One by one, his knights breach the city behind him, their ranks swelling the tide. The banner of the Lionheart rises once more, fluttering defiantly in the wind. The men trapped in the citadel who believed all was lost see it, and they erupt. Survivors pour from the gates, joining the desperate counterattack. The streets, once overrun by the enemy, become a maze of brutal, close-quarters combat. Steel clashes against curved scimitars. Shields clang against spears. Saladin's men are driven out, forced to retreat not from superior numbers, but from an overwhelming, relentless will. By nightfall, Jaffa is back in Crusader hands, preparing for the final blow. Richard doesn't pause to celebrate. He knows Saladin will return. This was merely a probing strike, not the full weight of the Sultan's mighty force. So he orders ships to be dismantled to build barricades, turning planks into palisades and sails into makeshift shields. He sends riders north, praying for reinforcements, and he waits. Jaffa becomes a crucible every man inside knows the next battle may well be their very last. Saladin returns with fire. At dawn on August 4th, Saladin's scouts return with their reports. Richard has no more than 2,000 men. His knights are few. The city, though defended, is isolated and vulnerable. Saladin smiles, a grim, determined expression. He marches with over 15,000 warriors. He will end this today. The final stand. Richard arranges his dwindling men outside the city walls in preformed battle positions. Lances planted into the earth like an unyielding iron forest. Crossbowmen arranged in efficient pairs, one fires, the other reloads. Infantry locked shield to shield, a solid wall prepared to receive the thunder of cavalry. As the vast Muslim army crests the horizon, Richard mounts his warhorse. He has only 10 other knights on horseback, but he rides to the front line calm, utterly composed amidst the mounting tension. Saladin sees him and hesitates. A flicker of something, perhaps grudging respect, perhaps a chilling premonition, crosses the Sultan's face. "So few," he mutters, his voice barely audible. "And yet so impossibly proud, he truly is a lion." The war drums begin their rhythmic, terrifying beat. The charge is called. The storm breaks. Saladin's mounted archers rush the field, a torrent of horse and arrow. Bolts fly, men fall. Dust clouds the sun, turning the world to a hazy, suffocating orange. But Richard's tactical genius holds. The rotating crossbow teams never let the assault rest. Every wave is met with fresh bolts. Every flanking maneuver crashes into a bristling hedge of spears. The Muslims feign retreat, hoping to draw the Crusaders forward to break their disciplined line. But Richard's men have learned their bitter lessons. They do not take the bait, they stand fast. For hours, the brutal battle rages, each side pushed to the absolute edge of exhaustion. The field becomes a mire of sweat, screams, and blood. The lions charge. Then Richard sees it, a hesitation, a fleeting crack in Saladin's seemingly endless ranks. He raises his sword high, a beacon of defiance, and shouts, "Now." The 10 knights, a mere handful, charge forward with the force of a battering ram. The infantry, galvanized by their king's roar, follows. The lion roars. They smash into Saladin's lines with explosive, unexpected force. The Muslims, worn down by hours of relentless crossfire, begin to break. But just as Richard tastes the sweet, bitter scent of victory, a desperate cry echoes, "The city, they've breached the gate." Saladin, ever the strategist, had sent a second force around the flank, now infiltrating the city behind the main battle. Richard turns. He does not hesitate. One last rescue. He pulls a small, vital strike force from the raging field, storms back into the city, and engages in a second, ferocious battle within the same day, street by street again. His men follow, driven not merely by command but by an unshakable, profound devotion to their king. And once again, miraculously, they win. Saladin's second force is expelled. The gates are sealed. The battle is over. The king breaks down. That night the Lionheart finally broke. Richard collapsed, racked by overwhelming exhaustion and a violent, consuming fever. His formidable body, pushed beyond all conceivable limits, had simply given all it could. He lay motionless, eyes half closed, his breath shallow and ragged. The doctors, grim-faced, whispered their fears the king would die. Saladin hears the news. He does not celebrate. In some accounts, the Sultan sends his personal physician, along with cooling fruits and ice brought from the distant mountains, a gesture of profound respect. He remembers not the sword but the extraordinary man who wielded it. This was no longer just war. This was mutual respect forged in the crucible of fire. Part 5. The Treaty and the Farewell. A king leaves, a legend remains. August 1192, Jaffa stands barely. Richard the Lionheart lies in a fevered haze, his once unbreakable body now cracking under the weight of endless battles. Outside, his knights whisper prayers. Inside, the greatest warrior of Christendom drifts between consciousness and death. And then a quiet miracle: he survives, an unexpected gesture. Not from divine grace, but from an enemy. Saladin, the man Richard had bled against in every corner of Palestine, did not gloat in his rival's suffering. Instead, in a gesture that transcended the brutality of war, he dispatched his personal physician to tend to Richard, along with cooling fruits and mountain ice from distant peaks. It was not a trick, not a bribe, but a clear, powerful message. "I would rather fight a man like you at full strength than watch you die in a bed." Two kings, two faiths, but now one profound understanding, the truce at Jaffa. Weeks passed, neither side could continue. Both armies were utterly exhausted, their ranks thinned by attrition. The Crusaders were too few to take Jerusalem. The Muslims were too stretched to hold more ground. The time had come not for conquest but for a grudging, necessary compromise. Both sides, bled dry, had finally reached their absolute limit. In early September 1192, Richard and Saladin agreed to meet via emissaries under a white tent not far from the scarred battlefield. What emerged was the Treaty of Jaffa. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims were guaranteed safe passage. Coastal cities captured by Richard remained in Crusader hands. A 3-year truce was declared. Both armies withdrew. It was not the glorious, triumphant ending most Crusaders had longed for, but it was honest, measured, and just. And for once in the brutal history of the Crusades, both sides kept their word. Final words between titans. Remarkably, these two titans of their age never met face to face. Yet through their trusted envoys, they exchanged words that would echo through history. Richard, in a message filled with genuine admiration, declared, "You have shown yourself a truly great prince, wise and strong in war. I shall carry respect for you to my grave." To which Saladin, recognizing a kindred spirit, replied, "And you, King of England, are the bravest man I have ever known. In war, respect is rare. In holy wars, it is almost unheard of." But Richard and Saladin rewrote the rules. The lion leaves the Holy Land. On October 9, 1192, Richard boarded a ship and began his long, arduous journey home. He had failed to take Jerusalem. He had failed to restore the true cross. But he had won something no other crusader king ever truly earned: the unified respect of his enemies, the unshakable loyalty of his troops, and the immortality of legend. He would never return to the Holy Land, Saladin's final year. Saladin returned to Damascus tired, victorious, but aged beyond his years by the relentless conflict. He donated most of his vast wealth to charity. He refused to build grand palaces or monuments to himself. When he died 6 months later, in March 1193, there was barely enough in his treasury to pay for his funeral. His tomb is modest. No gold. No grand declaration of glory, but on it are the words, "Here lies Saladin, who united Islam and repelled the Franks. Nothing of this world did he take with him." Legacy beyond the sword. Richard would later be captured in Austria on his way back to England, held for a crippling ransom, and spend the rest of his life embroiled in European politics and battles. He never set foot in Jerusalem. He never met Saladin again. But he never forgot him. The Sultan's image, both as a formidable foe and a fellow ruler, undoubtedly remained etched in his mind throughout his tumultuous life. Their rivalry had no true victor, because it birthed something far greater than conquest. Two men shaped by war but not consumed by hatred. Two leaders who saw each other not as monsters, but as reflections of their own burdens and honor. Two enemies who taught the world that respect is stronger than religious animosity, and honor lasts longer than any empire. Why this story still matters. Today, over 800 years later, the names Richard the Lionheart and Saladin still echo in textbooks, in legends,